After the war, motorsport restarted using whatever was available. In Italy, the pre-war Alfettas had been well hidden, and in 1950, when the governing body created the Formula One World Championship, Alfa Romeo was ready. The 1.5-litre, 8-cylinder engine, complete with two-stage turbocharging, now produced 370 brake horsepower instead of the 195 produced before the war. It would soon exceed 400. There was another difference. Released by Alfa Romeo, Enzo Ferrari had created his own team. That would become the backbone and be synonymous with Formula One for many years to come. They produced a normally aspirated 4.5-litre V12, which developed 350 brake horsepower. It may have been a little less powerful than the Alfa, but it had the advantage of being somewhat less thirsty, which meant that it could compete a full Grand Prix distance, while its rivals would have to refuel 2 or 3 times. Ferrari's 375 made good use of its advantage in scoring the team's first race win in the championship at the British Grand Prix in 1951, bringing to an end the Alfettas' victorious run. Beaten again in Germany and in Italy, the Alfettas were finally outclassed, and at the end of the 1951 season, Alfa Romeo decided to retire and rest on the laurels of their second world title rather than risk tackling a season too many. It was a blow for the championship, for Ferrari and their star driver Alberto Ascari were virtually without rival. In an effort to boost the fields and future Formula One regulations, the governing body decided to accept Formula 2 cars, but Ferrari were unchallenged. So in 1952, only the impecunious Gordini team attempted to challenge the intensely competitive Scuderia Ferrari, who ran the 500 model powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder engine. This car would win every Grand Prix of the year, perhaps not as incredible a feat as it might have been, but one that hadn't been repeated 40 years later. The Ferrari 500s did almost as well the following year, but this time their success was more praiseworthy, for Ferrari's quartet of Ascari, Farina, Villaraci and Hawthorn came under increasing pressure from Maserati's Argentine trio of Fangio, Gonzalez and Marimon. And while the title may not have been at risk, Ferrari's 500 ended up giving best to Fangio's Maserati in the final Grand Prix of the year. And that would end Ferrari's monopoly in Grand Prix racing. Over the next few years, Ferrari would be more and more seriously challenged. Mercedes pummeled all opposition into the ground in 1954 and 55, and then Maserati and Van Wall took over in challenging the Scuderia. Then they missed the boat when it came to the technical revolution begun by Cooper at the end of the 50s.
Propose a Ferrari subito di fare la vettura a motore posteriore, ma lui non la volle fare subito, perché anche lì lui sentiva l'opinione di tante persone che dicevano che la Ferrari, avendo il motore anteriore di produzione, le vetture di produzione Ferrari avendo motore anteriore, che anche lei guidava, non doveva mai fare una vettura a motore posteriore in corsa, perché se vinceva annullava i requisiti benefici della produzione. Mi ricordo il consiglio verso Ferrari del vecchio Taruffi, si ricorda l'ingegner Taruffi, che lui chiamò per sentire al solito il parere, e lui gli disse: ma guardi che qui ormai non c'è niente da fare, la strada è quella del motore posteriore, è inutile, non si può chiamare. E allora dette il permesso di fare la vettura a motore posteriore.
Ferrari's about turn coincided with the introduction of new Formula One regulations in 1961, engines limited to 1.5 litres unsupercharged. Ferrari's 156, powered by a V6 more powerful than the English 4-cylinders and characterised by its shark nose, would redress 2 humiliating seasons for the Scuderia when they were soundly beaten by what the proud engineer would call the English Assemblatori. However, the latter weren't giving up easily, and Moss routed the might of Modena at Monaco, thanks to his nimble Lotus and his own talent. The 156 powered Phil Hill to the World Championship crown, but it would not be followed up by more success. One would have to wait until the early 70s and the magnificent 312B for a successor. Its flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine, known as a boxer, could be fitted to a very low semi-monocoque chassis. The car largely dominated the second half of the 1970 season and the start of 1971 and should have taken Jackie Ickx to the championship. It did prove that accusations of the conservatism often directed at Ferrari weren't always justified.
La Ferrari ha introdotto moltissime novità, ma alla Ferrari non si fa la pubblicità. Alla Ferrari non si dice noi abbiamo fatto questo, perché è la Ferrari. Io ricordo che è la Ferrari che ha introdotto l'alettone sulle macchine. È la Ferrari che ha incominciato a fare le vetture con un forte effetto suolo quando le altre macchine erano strette. Quando abbiamo fatto la spazzaneve, tutti hanno riso. La spazzaneve è stata la T sperimentale. Quando la T è uscita noi abbiamo vinto tutto. Ma non hanno detto che c'era buona la tenuta di strada, hanno detto che avevamo molti cavalli. Quando vogliono diminuire i meriti della Ferrari dicono che ci sono molti cavalli.
If one omits the Formula 2 period of 1952 and 53, Ferrari's finest hour was with the 312T, the final letter indicating that it was equipped with a transverse gearbox behind the flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine. This family of cars raced from 1974 to 1980, and its various versions brought no fewer than 3 world titles and 30 victories for drivers Lauda, Regazzoni, Reutemann, Villeneuve and Scheckter, as well as 4 constructors' titles. The 312T marked the golden age of Scuderia Ferrari in Formula 1. But Formula One's history has always run in cycles. At the end of the 50s, Ferrari, the most famous and long-standing of World Championship entrants, was shown the way by just one of those assemblatori of whom he was so disdainful. That man was John Cooper, whose father began by building tiny single-seaters in a small garage in Surbiton, on the outskirts of London. Built for the motorcycle-engined 500cc class, the Cooper's cars were notable for their engines mounted behind the driver, the lightweight tubular chassis and their low price, which allowed British drivers to benefit from what were essentially the first Formula cars in which they could cut their teeth on the way to greater things. Thus was created a whole host of drivers and engineers who formed the base on which was built Britain's superiority in motorsport, which began in the early 60s. One of the most promising graduates of this school was Stirling Moss, who was a teenage purchaser of a Cooper 500. Appropriately then, Moss scored Cooper's first ever Grand Prix victory, his car powered by a 2-litre Coventry Climax in Argentina in 1958. It outclassed the front-engine Ferraris of Musso and Hawthorn in spite of a 500cc handicap. For the first time, the Italian Goliath would have to give best to the English David. Thus began a new era in Formula 1. But it was Jack Brabham more than Moss who symbolised this new era. He was Cooper's works driver, and it was he who claimed the world title in 1959 and 1960.
We went on to prove, really, that the rear-engine car was going to be there to stay, because it did have a lot of advantages over the front-engine car. From a traction point of view, weight distribution, getting the weight over the rear axle, and being able to put the power on the ground, because most of the front-engine cars couldn't put the power on the ground. The development of the engines, and you get a lot more horsepower. If you can't put it on the ground, that's not much use to you. And a rear-engine car does really help put the power onto the road.
At that time, general feeling ran against the idea of rear-engine cars simply because it hadn't worked with the hard-to-handle pre-war auto unions. It was thought that the reason the cars handled so badly was because of the engine's positioning. But the Cooper's success proved that to be false. In spite of a fairly basic tubular chassis and a less powerful engine than its Italian rivals, the Coopers proved that low weight and manoeuvrability could compensate for a lack of power, particularly on the most demanding of circuits. The Coopers rewarded Brabham's forceful style, which sometimes surpassed the car's own limits of road holding. And they responded magnificently to Stirling Moss's somewhat gentler and more precise style. Brabham's success during the 1959-1960 seasons encouraged every constructor to adopt the rear-engined layout. But while Cooper had arrived at this layout as a logical step, Lotus founder Colin Chapman took the format beyond the bounds of even the most imaginative designer. Chapman, quite simply, was one of the great geniuses of motorsport who would take his theories to the limit and constantly sought solutions to the most imaginative ideas which would mark 2 decades of motorsport. Chapman's Lotus 18 was a sort of refined Cooper, still with a multitubular chassis, but its successor, the 25, was the first monocoque chassis in Formula One, a chassis made of stressed, shaped aluminium moulded around bulkheads, and while not an original Chapman idea, is still the basis of Formula One chassis today.
C'est la première voiture qui représentait une approche de la sécurité passive en Formule 1. Le fait que cette voiture monocoque ait réussi et se soit imposée, que cette technique se soit imposée, a peut-être sauvé des dizaines de vies de pilotes parce qu'avant, le châssis était une structure multitubulaire et en cas d'accident, les tubes se pliaient, se cassaient et ils hachaient le pilote qui était à l'intérieur. Et c'est pas du tout d'ailleurs dans ce but spécifique que Chapman a fait la 25, c'était pour avoir une voiture plus rigide, plus légère. Mais il se trouve que tout de suite, quand on a vu cette voiture, Jim Clark, quand il est monté dedans, il a dit « Je ne monterai plus jamais dans une voiture qui ne soit pas monocoque ».
The great Jimmy Clark never drove for another team but Lotus in Formula One. He won 19 races and his 2 world championships came driving first of all the neat Lotus 25 and then its successor, the 33, the 2 most advanced cars in the early 60s. His driving was almost insolent in its apparent ease. Colin Chapman was entrusted with the first Ford Cosworth DFV V8 engine in 1967, and he designed the Lotus 49 around it, using the engine as a stressed member, again a first in Formula One.
See if it'll have a motor car. I hope so. So do I. Yeah, that's fitting well. Beautiful. Yep, that's the job. Lovely.
The chassis itself had a strange look. It finished right behind the driver's back and the rear suspension was part of the engine and gearbox assembly which was designed to take it. It was also a weight-saving solution which Graham Hill put to good use by winning the 1968 World Championship. Jim Clark took the Lotus 49 and its Cosworth engine to a remarkable debut victory at the Dutch Grand Prix in 1967, and the car and its derivatives would go on to win 12 Grand Prix in 3 seasons, in the hands of Clark, Graham Hill and Jochen Rindt. But more than that, it was the inspiration for other constructors in Formula One, rather as the Lotus 25 had been in building their cars for the new 3-litre formula introduced in 1966.
C'est sur la 49 que l'on a vu apparaître les ailerons pour la première fois. La première apparition d'ailerons en Formule 1, c'est Monaco en 68 et c'est sur la voiture de Graham Hill qui d'ailleurs l'a emporté. Il y avait 2 ailerons à l'avant et il y avait un capot arrière en forme de déflecteur.
Chapman's message soon made its mark.
À la course suivante, qui était le Grand Prix de Belgique, Brabham et Ferrari ont été un cran plus loin que Chapman en mettant des véritables ailerons, non seulement à l'avant mais à l'arrière aussi. Et aussitôt, Chapman a repris l'avantage. Il a mis des ailerons à l'arrière qui n'étaient plus fixés à la voiture, à la carrosserie, mais qui étaient fixés sur les porte-moyeux qui étaient donc mobiles.
But now Chapman and his fellow constructors began a trip up a dangerous blind alley as they developed bigger, higher and more fragile wings, which, when they failed, caused horrific accidents. The governing body had to put a stop to it, and quickly. But the basic idea was an extension of the use of cars' aerodynamics. No longer was it simply important that it cut through the air with ease, but that it was pushed down onto the ground to give it better grip. Chapman was the first to realise this with his designer Maurice Philippe and their joint production, the Lotus 72. It was in a Lotus 72 that Jochen Rindt died in practice for the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. But he would become posthumous world champion that year. Then it was Emerson Fittipaldi's turn to profit from the extraordinary potential of this innovative and revolutionary machine. Its shape not only produced a remarkable amount of downforce, but moving the radiators from the front of the car to the side pods made a significant change to weight distribution to the rear, which in turn improved traction and grip. Once again, this inspired concept from the fertile brain of Colin Chapman would be adopted by all his rivals. But the 72 was so advanced that it enjoyed an exceptionally long career, seeing service over 4 seasons. It was obviously a distinguished career as well, for this car would win more races than any other in the World Championship, winning 17 Grand Prix in the hands of Rindt, Fittipaldi and Ronnie Peterson. It became the JPS Special for a while, adopting the name of its sponsor. But the Lotus 72 helped Fittipaldi to the first of his 2 World Championships in 1972. But then, things turned sour.
C'était une voiture qui était faite pour marcher avec des pneus conçus spécialement pour elle, compte tenu du fait qu'elle avait un poids non suspendu extrêmement faible à l'avant. Et à l'époque, Chapman était avec Firestone, qui faisait des pneus spéciaux pour la 72, ce qui lui a permis de remporter ses succès. Et puis, Firestone s'est retiré de la compétition, Goodyear est venu, et Goodyear a fait des pneus pour tout le monde, puisqu'à l'époque, ils étaient les seuls fournisseurs de pneus. Ils ont fait des pneus standards qui ne convenaient plus du tout à cette voiture.
Chapman's last technical gift to Formula One before dying of a heart attack at the start of the 80s was the idea of using ground effect in Formula One. This comprised creating a depression beneath the car which would literally be sucked down onto the road. It was first seen on the Lotus 78, which appeared at the start of the 1977 season, but it suffered a lack of reliability. However, once again, Chapman and his associates, Tony Rudd and Peter Wright, had succeeded in eclipsing their rivals. Chapman had basically gained on 2 fronts. Downforce was no longer obtained by the wings. These were simply used to balance the car, so there was less drag. In order to produce the lack of pressure under the car, the side pod's undersides were shaped in order to accelerate airflow from the front to the rear of the car, and the extremes of the side pods were fitted with sliding skirts to make the sides airtight. The grip that this produced gave phenomenal road holding, and with it, Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson completely dominated the 1978 season. By winning 6 Grand Prix, the American took the World Championship ahead of his Swedish teammate, who would be tragically killed in the Italian Grand Prix, a race that was becoming the team's black spot after Rindt's accident in 1970 and being blamed for von Trips's in 1961. Once again, Chapman had caught his rivals unawares. But once again, however, less innovative but more painstaking rivals would catch him and overtake. After Chapman had died, one wondered who would become the guru of Formula One. At the start of the 80s, McLaren became the dominating force in Formula One. It had been founded in the 60s by the New Zealand Grand Prix driver Bruce McLaren, a former Cooper driver who had decided to go out on his own, but had been killed in testing in 1970. Co-directors had continued to run the team successfully, as demonstrated by the 2 championships won by Fittipaldi and Hunt in 1974 and 1976. But then success had dried up. The team was no longer a front runner when it was taken over by an ambitious team manager, Ron Dennis, who had the foresight to gather some talented and powerful people around him. There was the iron-handed designer John Barnard and the wealthy Mansour Oj with his company TAG, or Techniques d'Avant-Garde. Between them, they supplied the ultimate weapon, the MP4 chassis, fitted with a 1.5-litre V6 turbo engine, developed, built and run exclusively for them by Porsche. But the most important innovation was the use of super light carbon fibre to build the monocoque rather than aluminium, as well as the car's Coca-Cola bottle shape, which would soon be copied by other teams. The TAG Porsche-engined McLaren MP4s first of all took the 1984, 1985 and 1986 championships with Lauda and Prost. Technically speaking, these cars had the most developed and most efficient chassis, as much in terms of stiffness as aerodynamically. The engine remained one of the best throughout 1984 and 85 and would remain one of the most reliable as well. The combination of the engine chassis and Dennis's reliability meant that this was one of the most successful periods of any team in Grand Prix racing. Dennis had raised the standard of team organisation to unprecedented levels. He had managed to raise a substantial budget, but in return for this, and also because of it, he used all his motivation and his purest ideals to go about the business of motor racing in a much more detailed way, tackling each and every job with greater care and professionalism. But by raising that standard, everyone else now had to seek greater budgets in order to attempt to rival his team, and the price of victory was so high that few could afford it. Dennis had to pay dearly for his TAG Porsche engines, but Hondas, while just as competitive, were a great deal cheaper.
We were in a customer-supplier relationship. We were the customer, they were the supplier. As in any customer-supplier relationship, we were paying, they were receiving our money, and they were making an engine to our specification. At the time, it was an immensely successful program, but it was becoming apparent that it was not possible to finance to the level that was going to be required the 3.5-litre normally aspirated engine that was due to be introduced in '89. We chose to open discussions with Honda, and those discussions were based on the philosophy of our respective companies and the desire to have a real partnership. It was a sort of total commitment that you make, similar to a marriage. You know, it's for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, all these things, and that was a sort of level of commitment that we made.
And so continued the extraordinary run of success for the McLaren MP4. There was a brief interruption in 1987 when Williams Honda briefly took over, but in spite of the departure of Barnard, the original father of the MP4, the car's younger brothers and sisters remained competitive. From 1988 to 1991, the McLaren Hondas would win a further 4 consecutive titles, 3 for Senna, 1 for Prost. Unprecedented. Indeed, the sheer statistical success of the McLaren MP4 makes one reel. Between the McLaren TAG's first win at the 1984 Brazilian Grand Prix and the McLaren Honda's last win at the 1992 Australian Grand Prix, 9 seasons, these cars won 4 drivers' titles, 6 constructors' titles and 69 Grand Prix, an average of 7 wins per season for almost a decade. And that average rises to 9 per season if you take it from 1987 to 1992. Never had a team, and certainly not a car, spent so long at the peak of Formula One, a sport which, until Ron Dennis took over McLaren, had always seen constant swings and changes in power. Just as Chapman had been the master of technology and Ferrari has persevered for so many decades, so Ron Dennis, in terms of organisation, has left his mark on Formula One.